The frontier is filled with stories that ride on the wind, whispered by rivers and carried across plains where silence often says more than words ever could. Before we begin this tale, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story where courage and destiny meet on the open range. Your support keeps these campfires burning bright, and your voice in the comments helps carry these legends further than the trail ever runs. Now let me draw you close to the riverbank where this story begins. Swift water foaming white, jagged rocks glinting like the broken teeth of some sleeping beast, and one man watching from the high ground with the steady eyes of someone used to being alone. His name was Boone Carter, a man hardened by years of solitary travel, a man who trusted the rhythm of his horse's stride more than the words of strangers. Solitude was his companion, independence his creed. Yet on that morning, when the mountain storms had swollen the river into a frenzy, fate rose from the churning water in a form that would change his life forever. At first glance, it looked like any drowning traveler flailing against the merciless pull of the current. But Boone's eyes, trained by years of wariness, saw something more. The strokes were not wild but deliberate, strong, measured even in desperation. It was the struggle of a fighter, someone accustomed to commanding their own fate, now battling an enemy that cared nothing for strength or skill. The river itself. Without thought for himself, Boone slid from his saddle and plunged into the icy torrent. The cold struck him like a blade, cutting his breath short, but he pressed forward, driven by something he couldn't name. The figure ahead vanished beneath the surface, and for a heartbeat, Boone feared he had come too late. Then his arms closed around solid muscle, a weight far greater than he expected. She did not thrash against him. She did not claw or panic as drowning souls often did. Instead, her dark eyes locked onto his, even as the water dragged them both toward ruin. In that glance, he felt less like a savior and more like the one being tested. Together, they clawed their way to shore, collapsing on the stones in gasping unison. Boone lay there, chest heaving, his own strength spent. But when she rose, water streaming from her clothing, he realized she stood taller than most men he had met, near 6 feet of solid, commanding presence. Her buckskin garments clung to her powerful frame, beadwork flashing like tiny stars where the sun struck wet leather. She coughed the river from her lungs, then fixed him with eyes so sharp they made him instinctively take a step back. This was no ordinary woman. Her silence pressed on him heavier than words. She seemed to measure him, his courage, his intent, perhaps even his soul. Boone felt his heart beat faster, not from the river's strain, but from the unspoken weight of her gaze. Gratitude was absent. So too was hostility. What lingered instead was evaluation, as though she were deciding whether the man who had dragged her from the river was worthy of the life he had preserved. When she finally spoke, it was not in English. The words rolled like water over stone, foreign yet filled with a cadence that spoke of authority. Boone touched his chest, introduced himself with the plain honesty of a man who had no other way to bridge the gap. "Boone Carter," he said, her head tilted, eyes narrowing with calculation. Then her hand pressed to her own chest, and she gave him her name, Ayana. The sound of it rippled through the morning air like the river itself, smooth yet powerful. Something that could carry or crush depending on how it was treated. In the hours that followed, as evening shadows stretched across the wilderness, Ayana remained an enigma. She accepted his offered food, gathered wood for his fire, and carried herself with the poise of someone born to command. Yet her eyes often swept the horizon, her hand never far from the hidden blade at her side. She was not a rescued victim. She was a warrior, one whose presence unsettled Boone's long-nurtured solitude. He had saved her life, yes, but she seemed to be teaching him wordlessly that life owed him nothing in return. By morning, she was gone. Her footprints led away from his camp, her absence marked only by an eagle feather placed beside his bedroll. Deliberate, precise, impossible to mistake as chance. Boone turned the feather in his hand, its perfection unsettling him. He had thought himself a man of simple days and solitary miles, yet now he felt bound to something vast and mysterious, something larger than himself. The river had tested him. The woman had measured him. And deep inside, Boone felt the stirrings of a truth he could not yet name, that saving Ayana was only the beginning. The wilderness had many trials left for him, and this encounter would shape every trail he walked thereafter. So settle in, friend, for what follows is more than a tale of rescue. It is the story of a man who thought he was alone, a woman whose destiny was greater than herself, and a river that bound them together in ways neither could escape. It is a story of courage, of belonging, and of choices that reach further than the horizon. And it begins with one act of instinct that set fire to everything Boone Carter thought he knew about freedom, fate, and the meaning of a life worth saving. Ayana's silence was a fire in the dark, a presence that refused to be ignored, and Boone Carter found himself caught in the pull of her stillness long after the river water had dried from his clothes. That night by the campfire, when she sat across from him, her tall frame outlined in orange glow, he felt the weight of her wordless company press against the walls of his solitude. He had lived years without another soul beside him at sundown, years where the only sound was the hiss of grease in his skillet, or the slow creak of saddle leather as he shifted by the fire. But with her there, silent yet unyielding, it was as if the wilderness itself had gained new gravity. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, flicked often toward the hills as though she expected ghosts to step out of the shadows. And Boone, though he did not know her language, understood enough. Danger stalked her, and by accident or fate, it now stalked him too. She moved differently than others he had met, efficient, precise, like every motion of her hands, and every glance of her eyes had purpose. When she broke a piece of dried meat with her strong fingers, when she added wood to the flames with practiced ease, even when she settled herself on the earth with her knife hidden beneath her palm, she carried herself as someone born to live by law and discipline. Boone thought of the women he had known in the frontier towns, bent from hard work, faces lined by sun and sorrow, voices shrill with worry or dulled by resignation. Ayana was nothing like them. Even dripping wet from the river, coughing up water, she had seemed unbroken. Sitting now by the firelight, her chin lifted and her gaze untamed, she appeared carved from the same stone as the mountains that loomed behind her. Boone felt something stir in him, a mixture of admiration and unease, because he could not yet decide if he had rescued a woman or unleashed a storm. Her silence was not emptiness, but choice. He saw that in the way she weighed him when his eyes lingered too long, in the small tilt of her head when he tried to offer kindness she did not need. When at last she spoke, her words came in a river tongue he could not decipher, yet her tone struck him like the edge of a blade, neither hostile nor grateful, but testing. as if she had already decided that gratitude was a currency too cheap to spend on a stranger. Boone raised his hand to his chest and gave his name as plain as he could. Boone Carter. She repeated it in her own cadence, her voice a low murmur that made the syllables feel like part of some ritual. Then, with a hand to her chest, she gave him hers. Ayana. It was not a thank you, not a plea, not a promise, just a name, yet it struck him harder than any oath. For in that moment he realized this woman belonged to something greater than herself, a thread in a tapestry he could not yet see. And he felt an ache in his chest, because he, a drifter who belonged nowhere, had spoken his name into her keeping. As the fire burned down to embers, Ayana grew restless. She stood often, scanning the ridges, her profile outlined against the starlit sky. Her movements were too practiced to be habit. They were the watchful pacing of a scout, of someone who expected enemies to creep out of the night. Each time her hand brushed the hilt of her hidden knife, Boone's breath slowed, and he wondered if her silence was not protection for herself, but for him. She owed him nothing, yet she seemed unwilling to let harm fall his way. When the darkness deepened, Ayana approached him with sudden urgency. She gestured to herself, then to the black line of trees beyond the firelight, shaking her head firmly as if to say, "I cannot stay." Then she pointed at him, her gaze fierce, and made a gesture of stillness, of waiting. Before he could answer, she gathered her damp belongings, and with steps so quiet they seemed part of the night itself, she disappeared into the shadows. Boone listened to her retreat until the sound blended with the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. When dawn crept across the horizon, she was gone. Only the eagle feather remained, laid beside his bedroll with deliberate precision. He picked it up with calloused fingers, staring at the sheen of morning light on its barbs. No accident could have placed it so neatly. No wandering gust of wind could have set it so true. It was a token, a mark, perhaps even a warning. Boone felt the weight of it as though it were iron rather than air. That feather spoke to him in silence the way Ayana had spoken by the fire, words unvoiced, but heavy with meaning. He tucked it carefully into his saddlebag, knowing that no matter how far he rode, the presence of that feather would ride with him. All through the day's journey, his eyes turned again and again toward the northern hills, the same way her eyes had sought them last night. The trail he followed seemed suddenly less certain, his freedom less free. He had lived so long with only himself to account for that. The thought of another life brushing against his own unsettled him. Yet he could not deny that his solitude felt different now, emptier somehow, after a single night of silent company. Boone Carter did not yet understand that Ayana's disappearance was not an ending but a beginning. That eagle feather was no farewell. It was a tether, a quiet bond, a reminder that he had stepped into the current of a story larger than his own. And though the river had released him, fate had not. Boone Carter rode through the long afternoon with the eagle feather tucked safely into his saddlebag, each hoofbeat echoing against the hollow silence Ayana had left behind. The plain stretched wide and endless, but he could not shake the sense that the land itself was watching him, as if her eyes still lingered somewhere beyond the horizon. Solitude, once his chosen armor, now pressed in on him like a weight. Where before the sound of wind in the cottonwoods and the river's murmur had been enough, now the quiet felt raw and exposed. Ayana's absence spoke louder than her presence had, and the feather she had left seemed to whisper that her story was not finished with him. He had no way of knowing that fate was already racing toward him, carried on the thunder of hooves. By midday, the heat settled heavy, and Boone stopped in the shade of cottonwoods near the river to water his horse. He bent low, running a hand along the animal's flank when he heard it, a rhythm distinct from the wilderness, a sound too ordered to be anything but men on horseback. Straightening, Boone shaded his eyes and saw them cresting the rise, 12 riders, moving with a precision that carried the weight of discipline and purpose. They did not scatter or weave like wanderers. They advanced in formation, every horse keeping pace with the next, every rider straight-backed as if guided by some unspoken law. Boone's heart tightened. These were no bandits, nor were they white settlers cutting across the land at random. Everything about them, the beadwork on their gear, the feathered adornments that caught sunlight, the silent unity of their movement, spoke of warriors. Their arrival pulled the air taut with ceremony, as if the very earth held its breath. He knew in his bones this was not chance, and when the leader came into view, Boone understood immediately who they had come for. The man at their head bore the kind of authority that could not be faked. Older than the others, scarred in ways that told stories of survival, he carried himself with quiet command. Even at a distance, Boone felt the weight of his gaze. When the group halted 20 paces from his camp, the leader dismounted with fluid grace, each step deliberate, each motion saying without words, "Here stands a man accustomed to being obeyed." Boone's hand hovered near his holster out of instinct, but something in the man's bearing stilled him. "You pulled my daughter from the water." The voice was deep, fluent in English, each word carrying the measured cadence of diplomacy sharpened by truth. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict, spoken by someone who already knew the answer. Boone's chest tightened at the word daughter, the sound of it weaving instantly with Ayana's sharp eyes and proud silence. His throat went dry. "Yes," Boone managed. "I did." The man's eyes, dark and steady, studied him with the same intensity Ayana had used. There was recognition in them, not of Boone himself, but of what he had done. The other warriors remained mounted, watchful, but still. Their silence did not feel hostile. It felt ceremonial, like witnesses to a judgment being passed. "My daughter," the man continued, "is Ayana. She told me of the stranger who risked his life against the river." He paused, and for a heartbeat the wilderness seemed to bend around his words. "I am Nastus, chief of my people. And you, Boone Carter, have done something that requires acknowledgement." The word acknowledgement landed heavy, far heavier than gratitude ever could. Boone felt the solitude, the life he had carved from silence and distance, begin to shift beneath his feet. He had thought saving Ayana was an act finished at the riverbank, but Nastus's tone told him otherwise. What he had done was not closed. It was a door opening. Boone's instincts urged him to keep distance. He had built his years on freedom, on belonging to no one, on debts paid quickly, so no man could hold him. Yet, as Nastus spoke, Boone felt the hollowness of his solitary creed. The eagle feather weighed on his thoughts, and Ayana's silence returned in memory. He realized then that her measuring gaze had not been for her alone. It had been for this moment, when her father would stand before him with warriors at his back and a debt too heavy to deny. Nastas sat cross-legged upon the earth, a gesture of both humility and command, and gestured for Boone to do the same. The chief's voice lowered, carrying not threat, but truth. He spoke of Ayana's mission, of strangers who trespassed with fire and disrespect, of a river crossing that had nearly claimed more than a woman's life, It had nearly stolen the tribe's future. Boone listened, his heart heavy with revelation. He had not just saved a woman, he had saved a leader in the making. The weight of it pressed on him with startling clarity. His hands, which had dragged her from the river, now felt bound by invisible cords, tied to a people he did not yet know. Around them, the warriors remained still as stone, yet Boone felt their eyes upon him, measuring as Ayana had measured, weighing as Nastas now weighed. And in the midst of their gaze, something unexpected stirred in his chest, not fear, not pride, but the first fragile sense that perhaps his days of wandering without root had led him here for a reason. The silence stretched, broken only by the river's distant murmur. Then Nastas spoke again, his voice calm, final. "I have come to discuss your reward." The word struck Boone like a gunshot in the still air. Reward. But the way the chief said it, heavy with significance, made Boone's pulse quicken. This was no gift of coin, no sack of provisions. Whatever lay behind that word would change him. He felt it in his bones the same way he had felt the pull of the river's current, the certainty that once he stepped forward, there would be no turning back. And for the first time in years, Boone Carter wondered if the solitary path he had chosen was not freedom at all, but exile. The word reward lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, curling between them with meaning Boone Carter could not yet grasp. His heart thudded slow and heavy, as though it sensed the weight of what was coming before his mind could name it. Nastas, seated cross-legged upon the earth, watched him with steady eyes that bore no malice, no mockery. Only truth carried in the stillness of a man who had weathered storms greater than most could imagine. Around them, the warriors remained mounted, their silhouettes carved against the afternoon light, statues of vigilance and strength. Boone felt their gaze as keenly as he had felt Ayana's the night before, measuring him, silently questioning whether the man who pulled her from the river had the spirit to stand among them. Nastas spoke again, his voice smooth yet carrying a gravity that pressed into Boone's chest. "My daughter was not in the river by accident," he said, and though the words were calm, they rang with an edge of sorrow. "She was there because she chose the path of danger to fulfill duty. She is strong, skilled, but even strength bows before the river's current." His pause carried the unspoken truth. Ayana's life had hung by a thread, and it was Boone's hand that kept it from snapping. Boone swallowed hard, remembering the solid weight of her in his arms, the fierce intelligence in her drowning eyes. For the first time since dragging her ashore, he realized what might have been lost had he been a minute slower or a step too late. Nastas's gaze sharpened, as though he could see the thought forming. "Had you not acted," he continued, "our people would have lost more than a daughter. We would have lost our next leader." The words fell like stones in Boone's gut. He had not merely saved a woman, he had saved a future. The idea unsettled him, made the air around him feel charged, as though lightning hovered just out of sight. What had felt like instinct at the riverbank now revealed itself as destiny, and destiny carried chains as heavy as iron. "This," Nastas said, his voice lowering with finality, "creates what we call a debt of balance. When a life of such weight is saved, it cannot be repaid with words or simple gifts. A life for a life binds the rescuer and the saved together in ways that ripple through more than just two souls. It touches the tribe. It touches the land itself." His hand gestured to the soil beneath them, the river in the distance, the sky overhead. Boone felt the world expand around him, suddenly alive with threads he had never noticed, threads now pulling him closer to this circle of warriors. Boone's first instinct was to resist. His whole life since leaving the East had been built on freedom, on the ability to ride where he pleased, to speak when he chose, to answer to no one but himself. Independence had been his only loyalty. Yet as Nastas's words settled into him, Boone recognized a truth that gnawed at his chest. Independence had also been exile, a slow hunger that had left him hollow even when his belly was full. The eagle feather tucked in his saddlebag seemed to weigh more with each breath, its silent reminder that Ayana had already marked him in ways he did not understand. "You could have ridden on," Nastas said, his eyes never leaving Boone's face. The river was perilous, the outcome uncertain. Many men would have chosen their own safety. But you did not. There was no flattery in his tone, only fact stated plainly. You risked yourself for someone who was not your kin, not your people, not even of your language. Few men act in such a way. Fewer still act without expectation of return. Boone shifted uneasily under the weight of those words. His instinct had not been noble. It had been simple, immediate. Someone was drowning. He could not ignore it. And yet here was a man telling him that single choice had written him into a story far greater than himself. Any decent man would have done the same, Boone muttered, though even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into him. Was that true? How many riders would have pressed on, convincing themselves the river had claimed its toll and it was no business of theirs? "No," Nastas said firmly, his voice cutting like a blade through Boone's thoughts. "Most men say what they would do. Few act when the moment comes." His eyes burned steady, a reflection of the same fire Boone had seen in Ayana's. "You chose differently, and that choice has bound you to us." The air between them thickened. Boone's pulse quickened, not in fear, but in anticipation, like the seconds before a storm breaks. The chief's words were no threat, yet they left Boone feeling as though the ground beneath his boots had shifted. The solitary trail he had walked for years now forked, one path leading back into loneliness, the other towards something unknown and vast. At last, Nastas rose and walked to his horse, retrieving a bundle wrapped in soft leather. He returned with the care of a man carrying something sacred, and when he unwrapped it, the afternoon sun glinted on a medallion unlike any Boone had seen. The craftsmanship was ancient, its engravings intricate, its weight palpable even from a distance. "This," Nastas said, holding it high, "is the symbol of what you have done. It has been carried in my family for 7 generations. It is given only when a debt of balance must be honored." The warriors stirred in their saddles, their silence deepening, as though even the horses understood the gravity of the moment. Boone stared at the medallion, his throat dry, his heart caught between fear and yearning. Nastas's next words sealed the air around them like a drumbeat. "The medallion is not the reward itself. It is the symbol. The true reward is what it represents. Acceptance into our people, with all rights and all burdens. To belong, to stand not alone, but as one among us." The river's roar filled Boone's memory, mingling with Ayana's unflinching gaze and the feather she had left by his bedroll. He felt the echo of her silence now, not as absence but as invitation, belonging. The word felt strange in his mind, both terrifying and intoxicating. For the first time, Boone Carter wondered if the life he had built on solitude was not strength, but weakness, and if the river had pulled him into something he had been searching for all along. The medallion shimmered in Nastas's weathered hand, its surface catching the fading light as if it held fire within the etchings of its ancient craft. Boone Carter's gaze fixed on it, but his thoughts drifted inward, tangled in the weight of what the chief had revealed. He had not only saved a daughter, he had saved a future. Ayana was not just a woman with sharp eyes and silent strength. She was heir to a people, a thread that bound past to future. And by dragging her from the river, he had stitched himself into that fabric, whether he meant to or not. His chest tightened with the realization, as though invisible cords were winding around his ribs. Freedom had always been his creed, but for the first time, he wondered if freedom was nothing more than exile with another name. Nastas's voice broke the silence, steady and certain, cutting through Boone's restless thoughts like a blade. This debt of balance cannot be dismissed, and it cannot be answered with simple thanks. To let it lie unsettled would dishonor the river, dishonor my daughter, dishonor my people. Such debts ripple outward until they tear what should remain whole. You must understand, Boone Carter, that your choice has bound you to us already. The question is not whether you will belong. It is how you will choose to belong. Boone felt the warrior's eyes on him, silent but heavy, their stares like arrows tipped with judgment. He shifted where he sat, dust rising from the earth, the leather of his boots creaking in the quiet. His instinct wanted to resist, to protest that he had acted from impulse, not obligation. Yet when he opened his mouth, no words came. Because deep inside, he knew Nastas spoke truth. He could not deny the pull that had taken root since Ayana's gaze first measured him on the riverbank, nor the strange hollowness her absence had left when dawn revealed only her footprints and that feather beside his bedroll. That hollowness was not emptiness. It was a space waiting to be filled. Nastas leaned forward, his voice dropping into something softer, almost confessional. Another few minutes in that river, and Ayana would have been lost. Even her strength cannot fight what has no mercy. And had that thread been cut, we would not only have lost a daughter, but the leader meant to guide our people into the years ahead. His words trembled for just a breath, and in that moment, Boone glimpsed something rare in the chief's eyes. Vulnerability. A father's fear, still fresh, though hidden beneath layers of command. It struck Boone harder than any demand for loyalty. He knew loss. He had carried it like a stone in his gut for years, burying companions, burying love, burying even his own need for belonging. To hear it echoed in the voice of a man like Nastas bound him more surely than the medallion ever could. The air between them seemed alive, buzzing with unseen threads. Boone rubbed his calloused palms against his knees, feeling suddenly like the world had tilted and he no longer walked on steady ground. He had always thought himself a wanderer, a man who owed nothing to anyone. But here, in this circle of warriors and this chief's unwavering gaze, he felt as though his life had been weighed and found to matter in ways he had never considered. A part of him wanted to stand and walk away, to mount his horse and let the horizon swallow him whole. Yet another part, deeper and quieter, wanted to stay, to see where this path led. That quieter voice frightened him because it sounded too much like hope. "You see now?" Nastas said, rising to his full height, the medallion still in his hand. "This is no accident. The river claimed her, and you defied it. That defiance carries meaning. It is not chance that brought you to that bank, not chance that set your eyes upon her struggle, not chance that gave you the strength to pull her from the current. You may believe you are alone, Boone Carter, but the river teaches otherwise. It pulls us together or tears us apart. You chose to pull." The word settled into Boone's bones. heavy and immovable. He thought of Ayana's gaze as she wrung water from her hair, the way she had looked at him not with gratitude but with evaluation, as though she had known this moment was coming. He thought of her silence, which had spoken louder than any words, and the eagle feather she had left behind as proof that their paths were bound. He could almost hear her voice again, foreign yet full of weight, echoing the chief's truth. Nothing about this was chance. Boone lowered his head, his throat tight, his heart thudding like distant thunder. He did not know if he could carry the weight Nastas was placing on him. He did not know if he could become the man they expected. But in that instant, he recognized that the choice before him was not about obligation. It was about truth. A truth that perhaps he had been running from all his life. That solitude was not freedom. That to belong, even in hardship, was the only path that gave a man meaning. The medallion glinted in Nastas's hand once more, catching a shard of sunlight. The chief's voice, calm yet absolute, closed the space between them. The balance must be honored. What you saved was not just my daughter. You saved the future of our people. That cannot be forgotten, nor can it be left unanswered. Boone exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down like the current of the river itself. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a tide pulling him somewhere he could not resist. And though fear clawed at him, a flicker of something else rose alongside it, something that felt dangerously like belonging. Boone Carter sat in silence, the medallion's image etched into his thoughts, though Nastas had not yet placed it in his hands. The chief's words about balance, about debts too heavy to be left unsettled, still rang in his ears. The wilderness around them seemed to hold its breath, the wind low, the river's voice distant but insistent, as if nature itself awaited his answer. He wanted to speak, to tell the chief that what he had done at the river was instinct, not sacrifice, that he was no hero but only a man moved by the sight of someone drowning. Yet the truth lodged like stone in his chest. He could not undo the choice he had made. And Nastas's eyes, unwavering, told him that instinct or not, the deed had meaning beyond him. "You speak as though I had a choice that day," Boone muttered finally, his voice rough from disuse. "The truth is, Chief, I didn't. I saw her, and I acted." That's all he meant it as modesty, perhaps even protest. But Nastas only shook his head slowly, the lines in his weathered face deepening. "That," Nastas said, "is the measure of a man. Many speak of what they might do in moments of peril, but their words are as light as dust. Only when the river pulls at their legs do we learn who they are. You acted without hesitation, without calculation. That is why you sit here before me now, Boone Carter, instead of vanishing down the trail as a wanderer unknown. The river carried you to us, and in saving my daughter, you have saved more than you yet understand." Boone felt the weight of the warrior's eyes pressing upon him from every angle. They had not spoken since arriving, their silence a wall around him, but he knew they were listening, measuring his every movement, his every word. He shifted where he sat, suddenly aware of how small his solitary life must seem in comparison to theirs. Men bound together by loyalty, by purpose, by a code as old as the land itself. And he, a drifter who had lived by no law but his own, suddenly found that his freedom seemed brittle, like thin glass beside the stone of their unity. Nastas's voice deepened, steady as the earth beneath their feet. "Do not mistake this for chance. Had you turned your horse away, Had you ridden past as others would have, my people would now face mourning instead of balance. You are tied to us now, not by chains, but by the river's current, and currents do not let go. The words struck Boone harder than he cared to admit. For years he had prided himself on belonging nowhere. Towns came and went, faces faded, and the only companion he trusted was the horse that carried him. Yet here was a man telling him that his life had already become part of something larger, whether he wished it or not. The river had chosen him. Ayana had measured him, and now her father declared the bond unbreakable. Boone rubbed his hand across his jaw, the stubble rough beneath his fingers, and found his throat tight. "What if I don't want what you're offering?" he asked, though the words felt hollow even as they left him. Nastas regarded him with the patience of stone. "You may refuse the medallion," he said. "You may ride on and live your days as before. But understand this. Ayana will still carry the memory of the man who pulled her from death, and my people will still speak of you as one who owes a balance. You may try to outrun it, but balance has a way of finding what belongs to it." The quiet that followed wrapped around Boone like a noose. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths, and he realized that the choice before him was not one he could dismiss as easily as saddling his horse and riding west. The bond already existed. Denying it would not sever it. It would only leave it untended, festering like an old wound. And for a man who had buried too many regrets already, the thought of leaving this one to rot unsettled him more than the weight of belonging ever could. Nastas's eyes softened for the first time, the hard steel of a chief yielding to the weary ache of a father. "When I say you saved more than my daughter, I speak not only as a leader, but as a man who has known loss. Another hour, and I would have buried her beside her mother. Another hour, and my people would have lost their future. But you stood in that river, Boone Carter. You stood where death wanted to take her, and you said no." His voice broke slightly, though he covered it with a cough. "That is not a thing I can leave unanswered." The words carved deep into Boone's chest, stirring memories he had tried for years to bury. The grave of his own kin, the cold mornings when he had stood alone, the silence of loss that had haunted his nights. He saw in Nastas's eyes the same pain he had known, and in that shared sorrow, he felt the faint stirrings of something he had thought dead within him, understanding. The warriors shifted slightly in their saddles, but still no word passed among them. Their silence had transformed now, no longer the silence of judgment but of respect, as though they too understood that something more than negotiation was unfolding here. Something sacred. Boone lowered his head, his voice rough when it finally came. "If what you say is true, Chief, then I reckon the river has already claimed me as much as it spared her." The admission startled even him, but when he lifted his gaze, he saw a flicker of approval in Nastas's eyes. The chief stepped closer, the medallion gleaming in his hand. "The balance remains, Boone Carter. You may fear it, or you may embrace it, but you cannot deny it." And in that moment, Boone knew with a clarity as sharp as a blade that his days of wandering free and rootless were numbered. The river had bound him, Ayana had measured him, and her father had named the truth. There was no turning back from the path he had entered. Whether he stepped willingly or was carried, the current would have its way. The medallion gleamed between them, sunlight catching on its engraved surface, yet Boone Carter sensed it was only the surface of a deeper offering. His hands clenched loosely on his knees, his body torn between reaching for it and pushing it away. Nastas's words about the balance had already struck hard, But now, as the chief's gaze sharpened, the promise of what lay beyond that symbol pressed closer. The silence of the warriors deepened, their stillness heavy, as if they too awaited his response to something more profound than mere thanks or repayment. Boone's throat felt dry. He had faced storms and ambushes, hunger and isolation, but he had never faced this, a choice that promised to remake the very ground he stood on. Nastas spoke again, his voice lowering to a tone both ceremonial and intimate, as though speaking not only to the man before him, but to the ancestors listening through the wind. "This medallion," he said, "is not a gift of ornament. It is a key. It marks a man who is no longer outside, but within. One who is welcomed as a son, a brother, a voice in the circle." He held it higher, and even the horses seemed to shift uneasily as the light struck it. To accept it is to accept us, and with us, all that we are. Boone's chest tightened at the words. A voice in the circle, a son, a brother. He had not been called such things in years, not since war and loss had stripped him bare and left him drifting. He remembered the graves he had left behind, the hollow nights when no one waited for him. No one cared whether he rose or fell. The idea of stepping into a people, of belonging in truth rather than in passing, cut through his chest with a fierce ache. Yet alongside that ache came fear, a sharp whisper reminding him that belonging also meant surrender. Surrender of his solitary creed, surrender of the freedom he had guarded like a weapon. Nastas, reading the conflict in his face, continued steadily. To belong is not to lose yourself, but to discover yourself in the eyes of others. You will have land, protection, a seat at our fire. You will stand beside warriors when danger comes, and you will share in the harvest when peace returns. Our joys will be your joys, our grief, your grief, and in time. His eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon, then returned with quiet weight. In time, perhaps even a family of your own. The implication struck Boone like a hammer. Ayana's face came unbidden to his mind, her dark eyes sharp as flint, her silence that had weighed more than words. He remembered how she had stood dripping on the riverbank, unbroken, despite the river's fury. How she had moved with watchful grace around his campfire. How she had left behind the eagle feather as a token. He had thought of her since, more than he wanted to admit. And now the chief's words set those thoughts aflame. The possibility of something more than solitary miles, more than fleeting encounters in dusty towns, a life beside someone whose strength matched his own, pulled at him, dangerous and intoxicating. Still, the fear clawed at him. "And if I accept," Boone asked, his voice low, "what do I give up?" Nastas's answer came without hesitation. The right to walk away without consequence. The right to live as if your choices touch no one. The right to be rootless. The chief's gaze pierced him, sharp but not cruel. You will no longer be a man apart. You will answer when your people call, as they will answer when you call. It's not a light thing, Boone Carter. Once chosen, it cannot be undone. The finality in those words chilled him, but beneath the chill, something warmed. Was this not what he had secretly yearned for on those endless nights alone? He remembered staring at campfires that burned down to ash, wishing for a voice across from him, wishing for a hand to steady the silence. And now that wish stood before him, dressed not in sentiment, but in iron truth. He felt caught between the man he had been and the man he might yet become. Nasta stepped closer, the medallion held out now, the leather wrapping sliding back to reveal it fully. Its surface caught the sun in full, and Boone felt as though it carried the firelight of 100 hearths within its design. "The reward I offer you is not gold, not weapon, not horse. It is this, a place among us. It is the chance to cease wandering. It is the chance to belong." The word belong echoed in his chest, louder than the chief's voice, louder even than the whisper of the river nearby. Belong. He thought of Ayana's steady gaze, of her silence that had left him restless, of the eagle feather that seemed to burn in his saddlebag with every mile he rode. He thought of the graves he had left, the loneliness he had worn like armor. For years he had told himself that to wander was freedom. But in this moment, staring at the medallion, he wondered if wandering had been nothing but running, from loss, from memory, from the truth that even the strongest man could not carry life alone. His hand twitched, half rising toward the medallion before he forced it back to his knee. He wasn't ready yet, but the pull was undeniable. The silence of the warriors, the patience of the chief, the weight of Ayana's memory, all of it pressed on him like the river's current, demanding he choose whether to fight it or let it carry him. And deep down, Boone knew. Whether he accepted the medallion now or not, he was already no longer the same man who had ridden to that riverbank. The balance had marked him. Ayana had measured him. Nastas had named him. He belonged already. The only choice left was whether to embrace it or deny it. Boone Carter's hand still hovered near his knee, trembling with the urge to take the medallion, and yet frozen by fear of what it meant, when a shadow moved at the edge of the gathering. He turned, and there she was, Ayana, emerging from the tree line with the same silent grace that had unsettled him since the river. She walked with the confidence of someone who belonged to both earth and sky, her long strides purposeful, her chin lifted, her dark hair braided and bound with fresh beadwork that caught the dying light like sparks. Boone's breath caught at the sight of her, and for a moment, the tension of warriors, the weight of Nastas's gaze, the gleam of the medallion, all of it faded into the background. Only she remained, like the river itself, impossible to ignore. Nastas inclined his head ever so slightly as she approached, and the warriors parted in respectful silence. She did not hesitate, did not linger on the men who watched her. Her eyes found Boone's immediately, sharp and unrelenting. He felt the same sensation as that first moment on the riverbank, that he was not the one judging, but the one being judged. Her stare was not cruel, but it carried weight, as though she held in her gaze the power to measure the marrow of his soul. "You hesitate," she said, her English careful, accented, but strong enough to strike him like an arrow. The sound of her voice in his language startled him. He had not expected it, though he realized now she had always understood more than she let on. Her words carried both challenge and invitation. "Why?" Boone shifted, his mouth suddenly dry. "Because once I take it," he said slowly, nodding toward the medallion, "there's no turning back." Ayana's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning. "When you pulled me from the river, did you think of turning back?" The question cut him deeper than he expected. He remembered the cold water, the roar of the current, the sight of her head slipping beneath the surface. He had acted before thought, driven by something beyond reason. "No," he admitted, his voice low. "I just acted." Ayana stepped closer, her tall frame casting part of him in shadow. She stood only a pace away now, the firelight glinting on the knife at her side, the beads in her braids, the intensity of her eyes. Exactly, she said. You saw danger, you saw need, and you moved. That is why my father believes you belong among us. That is why I believe it too. The murmurs of the warriors, faint and low, stirred at her words. Boone felt his heart pound in his chest, not from fear of them, but from the closeness of her, the certainty in her tone. She was not offering him gratitude, not even offering him choice. She was offering him truth, sharp and clear as a blade. You think you are not ready, she continued, her voice steady as she gestured toward the river in the distance, its shimmer still visible under the waning sun. But the river does not wait for readiness. The river takes or spares, and you did not flinch. That is what we need. Not perfection, not certainty, courage. Her words struck something deep in Boone, a place he had long walled off. He thought of the years behind him, wandering with no anchor, convincing himself that solitude was strength. Yet here stood a woman who had nearly drowned, telling him that his instinct to act had revealed more than he dared to claim for himself. He felt something shift within him, a loosening of the chain he had wrapped around his own heart for so long. "And if I fail?" he asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "If I take this medallion, if I try to stand among you and I fail?" Ayana's eyes softened, though her voice did not lose its edge. "Then you will rise again." "Among us, no one stands alone. If you stumble, others hold you up. If you bleed, others bind the wound. That is what it means to belong. And if you still think you cannot bear it, remember this. When you saved me, you became bound to me as I became bound to you. I am responsible for your life, as you are for mine. You will not walk this path without me." The fire cracked between them, sparks rising into the dusk. Boone's breath caught at the sound of her words. Bound, responsible, together. He felt the ground shift again, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the terror of isolation clawing at him. Instead, he felt the dangerous warmth of possibility. To learn from her, to stand beside her, to see her eyes softened not with judgment, but with something he dared to hope might one day become trust. Nastas remained silent, watching with the patience of one who knew this moment belonged to his daughter and the man she spoke to. The warriors shifted only slightly, their stillness a frame around the fire-lit tableau of Boone and Ayana. For Boone, the world had narrowed to her words, her presence, the promise she carried in her steady voice. Ayana reached out then, not to touch him, but to gesture toward the medallion still held in her father's hand. "This is not just an ornament. It is a promise. Take it, and you will not walk alone again. Leave it, and you will carry the weight of the river unfinished in your soul." Boone swallowed hard, his throat aching, his chest heavy with the pull of two worlds, the life of solitary trails and the life Ayana and her father were offering. The wind stirred her braids, the beads clicking softly like tiny echoes of the river's current, and Boone realized that whatever choice he made, his life was already changed. The eagle feather in his saddlebag seemed to burn against his thoughts, and Ayana's words echoed inside him like the river's roar. And in that moment, Boone Carter understood that his fear was not of failing, but of belonging. The fire had burned down to coals, glowing embers that pulsed like the heartbeat of the night, and Boone Carter sat with his gaze fixed on the medallion in Nastas's hand. The world around him, the warriors, the river's murmur, even the vast canopy of stars overhead, seemed to fall away until there was only that gleam of ancient metal and the weight of decision pressing on his chest. His pulse drummed slow and heavy, each beat echoing the truth he could no longer ignore. He had been a wanderer too long, mistaking rootlessness for freedom, convincing himself that to belong nowhere was strength. Yet Ayana's words still cut through him like the current of the river. You did not flinch. She had named what he had done without hesitation, and her voice had left him with no place to hide. He remembered the feel of her in his arms, solid and strong, even as the river tried to claim her. He remembered her eyes, fierce even while gasping for air, and how she had measured him in silence afterward. She had not asked for gratitude, nor had she offered it. Instead, she had left him the eagle feather, a token that carried a weight far heavier than its fragile spine. That feather now burned in his saddlebag like a coal against his thoughts, and he realized he could not return to the man who had found it. He was already altered. Boone's hand twitched toward the medallion, then withdrew, his breath catching. What if he failed? What if he accepted this gift and proved unworthy? The fear gnawed at him, sharper than any blade. For years he had lived where failure touched no one but himself. If his crops failed, no one starved but him. If he fell ill, no one suffered the loss but his own body. To belong meant to risk others' disappointment, to bear the weight of shared consequence. That thought terrified him, as much as it stirred something in his heart he could no longer deny. Ayana stepped closer, her presence filling the night more powerfully than the firelight. Her tall frame seemed carved from shadow and flame alike, her beadwork glinting faintly as she moved. She said nothing now, but her eyes held him, steady and unyielding. Boone found his gaze drawn to her, the way the river pulls a branch caught in its current. It was not force, it was inevitability. He realized then that the fear in his chest was not of the tribe, nor of their judgment. It was of her, of the bond that had already taken root, of the possibility that he might one day need her as much as he already felt she might need him. At last, Boone rose slowly to his feet, the movement drawing the attention of every warrior around the fire. Their stillness deepened, silence falling thicker than a blanket of snow, until even the night itself seemed to pause. He looked at Nastas, then at Ayana, then at the medallion. His voice when it came was rough but steady. "I accept." The word carried through the circle like a spark leaping from ember to ember. Nastas's eyes warmed for the first time, a faint smile tugging at his weathered face. The chief rose, stepped forward, and with both hands lifted the medallion. He placed it carefully around Boone's neck, the cool weight of the metal pressing against his chest. But instead of feeling like a chain, it felt alive, pulsing faintly with the warmth of the fire. Boone drew a breath that seemed to fill more than his lungs. It filled the hollow places inside him that had ached for years. "From this day forward," Nastas said, his voice carrying the authority of earth and sky alike, "your welfare is our welfare. Your struggles, our struggles. Your victories, our victories. You are no longer alone." The warriors, as one, lifted their voices, not loud, but deep and resonant, a chant that rolled like thunder across the night. Boone stood still, his throat tightening, surprised by how much their acceptance stirred in him. Yet it was not the warriors' voices that truly shook him. It was Ayana's smile, faint but bright, lit by the fire as she watched him. For the first time, her eyes no longer weighed or measured him. They welcomed him. Boone lowered his head, his fingers brushing the medallion. The metal felt heavy, yes, but not burdensome. It felt like a promise, one he had been running from all his life. without realizing it. He had belonged to no one for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to have anyone care whether he rose or fell. And now, as the chant faded and the firelight flickered, he knew. He belonged here. The fear did not vanish. It lingered, sharp at the edges of his mind, but alongside it grew something stronger. Resolve. He had not chosen the river, nor the woman in its current, but he had chosen this moment. And in that choice, he felt himself become more than the drifter he had been. He felt the faint beginning of a man who could stand not only for himself, but for others. Ayana stepped to his side then, not close enough to touch, but near enough that he could feel the heat of her presence. "Now," she said softly, her voice carrying only for him, "you will not walk alone again." And Boone, with the medallion resting warm against his chest, believed her. The fire had burned low, its flames surrendered to a steady bed of coals that glowed like the quiet heart of the earth itself. Boone Carter sat among them, the medallion warm against his chest, its weight both strange and familiar, as though it had always been waiting for him. The warriors had settled into their places, silent figures whose breaths rose in mist against the cooling night, but Boone felt their watchfulness even in rest. He was one of them now, no longer the stranger at the edge of the firelight, but a man seated within the circle. The truth of it pressed against him with a heaviness that was not burden, but belonging. He thought of the years behind him, each night alone by a campfire where no voice answered his silence, each trail where no one cared whether he returned. For so long, he had convinced himself that solitude was freedom. Yet now, in this circle of warriors, with the echo of their chant still humming in his bones, he realized that solitude had been exile all along. Belonging was not the end of freedom. It was the discovery of purpose within it. Nastas's voice carried once more, low but commanding, a river current steady and sure. The balance is restored. But know this, Boone Carter, the true test of belonging is not the medallion, nor even your word tonight. It is how you will act when our people are in need, when danger presses close, when your courage is asked again. The river is only the beginning. Boone nodded slowly, the words settling deep. He understood. He had not been welcomed into ease, but into responsibility. He had not been given safety, but duty. And strangely, that truth did not fill him with dread. Instead, it steadied him, like a man who had finally planted his boots on solid ground after years of wandering loose earth. As the warriors prepared for rest, Ayana moved to his side. She did not speak at once, only studied him with those fierce eyes that had once measured him, and now, for the first time, seemed to soften. The firelight caught her profile, the proud set of her chin, the strength in her tall frame, and Boone felt a quiet pull in his chest, as steady as the medallion's weight. "My father's offer included more than place," she said finally, her voice low, meant only for him. "It included the possibility of family, of binding not just to the tribe, but to one of us. That choice belongs not to him, nor even to the circle. It belongs to you." And to me, her honesty struck him harder than any blade. Boone's breath caught, and for a long moment he said nothing. Marriage. The word rang through his thoughts like the echo of church bells from a life he had nearly forgotten. He had buried the idea with his grief years ago, when the graves he left behind had stripped him of the hope of ever building something lasting again. And yet, here it was, offered not as demand but as possibility. He met her gaze, steady now, his voice rough with truth. "I'd like the chance to find out." A small nod answered him, one simple, decisive gesture. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was enough. Boone felt warmth bloom in his chest where emptiness had lived for so long. The possibility of future, not just of survival, but of companionship, stirred like a seed pressed into fertile ground. Nastas rose once more before the night gave fully to rest. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying across the circle, "we ride." The strangers who disrespect this land move closer. They burn what they do not need. They take what is not theirs. We must deal with them before they deal with us. His words settled like steel into the air. The warriors lifted their heads, their eyes sharp with readiness. Boone straightened, his jaw tightening. His first test would come sooner than he thought. No time to ease into this belonging. No slow passage into their trust. The medallion had been placed upon him, and already it demanded proof. Strangely, the thought did not chill him. Instead, it filled him with resolve. He had lived through dangers before, alone and rootless. Now he would face them not as one man against the world, but as part of something greater. He glanced at Ayana, and her eyes met his with steady fire. In them, he saw not doubt, but expectation, and in that expectation, trust. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of another's belief in him, and it steadied him more than any weapon at his side. That night, as the fire's glow dimmed and the warriors settled into slumber, Boone lay awake, staring at the stars. The medallion rested against his chest, warm as if it held the fire still within. He thought of the river, the way it had pulled at him, the way it had nearly claimed Ayana, the way it had forced his hand without hesitation. He realized that moment had not been an accident. It had been a crossing, a threshold between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The eagle feather lay tucked in his saddlebag, its presence as constant as the medallion now against his skin. Between the two, he felt bound to this path with a certainty that no fear could unmake. Solitude no longer called to him. Belonging did. And though danger waited with the coming dawn, Boone Carter felt ready. Ready to stand with them, ready to face what lay ahead. Ready, perhaps, even to discover the kind of life that could not be found in wandering, but only in the courage to stay. He closed his eyes at last, sleep stealing over him, as the river's song murmured in the distance. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Boone Carter did not dream of emptiness, but of firelight, of fierce eyes softened by trust, and of the promise of a tomorrow he no longer faced alone.